So this is going to be another movie review. This one's called Witchfinder General. The movie poster. Great. Pretty cool looking stuff. Nice movie poster. I love this flick. I'm giving it 5 out of 5 stars. It's just as brutal and unrelenting as I remember. Vincent Price is great as the Conqueror Worm, Witchfinder General. I knew this movie as the Conqueror Worm back in the 90s, but they're calling it Witchfinder General now. And that's the title on the actual movie itself. I posted links to the movie and the trailer in the description. Witchfinder General, titled on screen as Matthew Hopkins' Witchfinder General. So actually, the on-screen title is Matthew Hopkins' Witchfinder General. I should have made that distinction. I'm sorry. There was Matthew Hopkins in the upper right corner, and then on the bottom it said Witchfinder General. Witchfinder General is a 1968 British period folk horror film directed by Michael Reeves and starring Vincent Price, Ian Ogilvy, Hilary Dwyer, Robert Russell, and Rupert Davies. The screenplay by Reeves and Tom Baker was based on Ronald Bassett's 1966 novel, Witchfinder General. The film is a heavily fictionalized account of the murderous witch hunting exploits of Matthew Hopkins, Vincent Price, a lawyer who falsely claimed to have been appointed as Witchfinder General by the Parliament during the English Civil War to root out sorcery and witchcraft. The plot follows Roundhead soldier Richard Marshall Ogilvy, who relentlessly pursues Hopkins and his assistant John Stern, played by Robert Russell, I should say, after they prey on his fiancée Sarah, played by Hilary Dwyer, and they execute her priestly uncle John Lowes, played by Rupert Davies. Made on a low budget of under £100,000, the film was produced by Tygon British Film Production in the United States, where it was distributed by American International Pictures, AIP. Witchfinder General was retitled The Conqueror Worm, titled on screen as Matthew Hopkins' Conqueror Worm by AIP. So there you have it. The British version is Matthew Hopkins' Witchfinder General, and the US version is Matthew Hopkins' Conqueror Worm. AIP linked it with their earlier series of Edgar Allan Poe adaptations directed by Roger Corman and starring Price because its narrative bears no relation to any of Poe's stories. American Prince bookend the film with his poem, The Conqueror Worm, being read through Price's narration. All right. So there you have the explanation for the 4 different names. Production companies Tygon British Film Productions and American International Pictures, also known as AIP, distributed by Tygon Pictures. Release date May 19th, 1968. Running time perfect 86 minutes. Country United Kingdom. Language English. Budget of £83,000 and a box office of $1.5 million North American rentals. In 1645, during the English Civil War, Matthew Hopkins, an opportunistic witch hunter, takes advantage of the breakdown in social order to impose a reign of terror in East Anglia. Hopkins and his assistant, John Steam, visit various villages to torture confessions out of suspected witches. They charge the local magistrates for the work they carry out. Richard Marshall is a young Roundhead after surviving a brief skirmish and killing his first enemy soldier, and thus saving the life of his captain. He rides home to Brandeston, Suffolk, to visit his lover Sarah, the niece of John Lowes, the village priest. Lowes gives his permission to Marshall to marry Sarah, telling him there is trouble coming to the village and he wants Sarah far away before it arrives. Sarah tells Marshall that they have been threatened and have become outcasts in their own village, and Marshall vows to protect her. At the end of his army leave, Marshall rides back to join his regiment and chances upon Hopkins and Steam on the path. Marshall gives two men directions to Brandeston, then rides on. In Brandeston, Hopkins and Steam immediately begin rounding up suspects. Lowes is accused at his home and tortured. He has needles stuck in his back in an attempt to locate the so-called Devil's Mark, and is about to be killed when Sarah stops Hopkins by offering him sexual favors in exchange for her uncle's safety. Off camera, of course, I think we get a slight nipple shot of her when she's making love to the Roundhead while she's taking a little nappy poo. At her uncle's church. Hopkins is called away to another village, and Steam takes advantage of Hopkins' absence by raping Sarah. The camera sort of went away from that rape scene pretty fast. He instructs Steam to begin torturing Lowes again. Shortly after departing the village, Hopkins and Steam execute Lowes and two women. Marshall returns to Brandeston and is horrified by what has happened to Sarah, vowing to kill both Hopkins and Steam after marrying Sarah in a ceremony of his own devising and instructing her to flee to Lavenham. He rides off by himself. In the meantime, Hopkins and Steam have become separated after a Roundhead patrol attempts to commandeer their horses. They're having trouble finding decent horses in these towns. Marshall locates Steam, but after a brutal fight, Steam is able to escape. He reunites with Hopkins, and Steam informs him of Marshall's desire for revenge. Hopkins and Steam enter the village of Lavenham on a patrol to locate the king. Marshall learns that they are there and quickly rides to the village with a group of his soldier friends. However, having earlier learned that Sarah was in Lavenham, Hopkins has set a trap to capture Marshall. Hopkins and Steam frame Marshall and Sarah as witches and take them to the castle to be interrogated. Marshall watches as needles are repeatedly jabbed into Sarah's back, but he refuses to confess to witchcraft, instead vowing again to kill Hopkins. He breaks free from his bonds and he stamps on Steam's face while his army comrades approach the castle dungeon. Marshall grabs an axe and he repeatedly strikes Hopkins. The soldiers enter the room and they are horrified to see what their friend has done. One of them, Marshall's friend, Trooper Swallow, puts the mutilated but living Hopkins out of his misery by shooting him dead. Marshall's mind snaps and he shouts, "You took him from me! You took him from me!" And that is one of the greatest all-time endings in movie history. This has got to be one of the top 20 movies, which is probably why Adrian asked me, or somebody asked me, to re-review it again. Adrian's been doing that for a long time, and I refused. But with the Vincent Price movies like Witchfinder General, I decided to make an exception, watch it again, and review it again. And surprise, surprise, I loved it as much as I did 20, 30 years ago. From 1645 to 1647, Matthew Hopkins and John Steam traveled the east of England as witch hunters. There's a picture of Matthew Hopkins confronting witches and their imps. They harshly interrogated suspected witches using methods such as sleep deprivation, examining them by pricking for a witch's mark, or sometimes threw an accused witch into water for a swimming test. Local authorities paid for these services plus expenses. Shortly before his death from consumption in 1647, Hopkins published The Discovery of Witches, his treatise on witch hunting. In one of his illustrations, he was labeled the Witchfinder General. Ronald Bassett's Witchfinder General, a novel loosely based on the historical Hopkins and Steam, was published in 1966. Tony Tenser, the founder and chief executive of Tygon British Film Productions, read Bassett's book while it was still in galley form and purchased the film rights on impulse before publication. Tenser felt it had some scope and some breadth to it. There was canvas for a film. Michael Reeves, who had just completed Tygon's The Sorcerers, starring Boris Karloff, provided a story outline which met with Tenser's enthusiastic approval. Tenser immediately began putting together a preliminary budget and requested that Reeves quickly complete a full film script, stressing to Reeves that the production would need to commence by September of that year to avoid shooting during cold weather. Reeves called in his childhood friend Tom Baker, who had co-written The Sorcerers with Reeves, to assist him with the script. Reeves and Baker began drafting a screenplay with Donald Pleasance firmly in mind as the film's star. However, once American International Pictures became involved in the production, they insisted that their contract star, Vincent Price, be given the lead, and Pleasance was dropped from the film. With the abrupt change of star, Reeves and Baker had to rethink their original concept of presenting Hopkins as ineffective and inadequate, a ridiculous authority figure, which they had believed Pleasance could perform effectively. They knew the tall, imposing Price, with his long history of horror roles, would have to be more of a straightforward villain, and they made changes to their script accordingly. As was required by law for British film productions of that time, the completed first draft of the screenplay was presented by Tenser to the British Board of Film Censors, BBFC, on 4th of August to determine if any possible censorship issues could be anticipated. On the same day, a preliminary report was issued by a BBFC examiner who, commenting that Tenser was an ape, referred to the screenplay as perfectly beastly and ghoulish. The script was returned to Tenser a few days later with a more detailed report from the same examiner, which described the screenplay as a study in sadism in which every detail of cruelty and suffering is lovingly dwelt on. After a second draft was written and sent to the BBFC only 11 days after the first draft, the reaction was nearly the same. It was returned to Tenser with a long list of requirements to reduce the film's possible offensiveness. Reeves and Baker completed a third and final draft that was substantially toned down in content from the previous attempts. The version of the screenplay, which was further revised during production, was missing many of the more explicit moments of violence described in the first submitted drafts, the death spasms of the pre-credits hanging victim, Lowe's getting stabbed 15 times with a steel spike, and a sniper's victim somersaulting through the air and slamming into a tree. A sequence depicting the Battle of Naseby was to be filmed, during which a soldier's head was to be cut off on screen. Most significantly, the film's finale was completely altered. In the original ending, Steen falls in with a group of gypsies and attempts to rape one of their women, who successfully fights off her attacker by plunging her thumbs into his eyes, blinding him. The gypsies then stake him to death. Marshall arrives and convinces the gypsies to assist him in ambushing Hopkins. Hopkins is viciously beaten by Marshall, who forces a confession out of the bloodied man. Marshall partially drowns Hopkins, whose thumbs have been tied to his feet, and then finally hangs him. Tensor had previously expressed concerns regarding the scope of the Battle of Naseby sequence, as well as the gypsy ending, as these scenes would both require the employment of additional groups of extras. He asked Reeves and Baker to remove the battle sequence and simplify the ending for the final draft. Price was not Reeves' choice to play Hopkins. This was the veteran horror star's 75th film and his 17th for American International Pictures. The role was a great challenge for Price, as his frequent clashes with Reeves left him unsure as to what the director wanted. Despite this, Price felt he delivered one of his best performances I've ever given. Can't argue with that. Ogilvy and Reeves had been friends since they were teenagers, and the actor appeared in many of the director's amateur short films. Ogilvy also starred in both of Reeves' two previous films, The She-Beast and The Sorcerers. I'm going to have to look into those two. And he was the first choice for the role of Witchfinder's lead. Describing his working relationship with Reeves, Ogilvy observed that his mastery of the technical aspects was absolute, but added Mike never directed the actors. He always said he knew nothing about acting and he preferred to leave it up to us. Ogilvy enjoyed working with Price, finding him to be very funny in a Queenie sort of way. Witchfinder was Dwyer's debut feature film. With 3 years of television work behind her, she had been noticed by Tensor and put under contract with Tygon at the age of 21. She felt Reeves was just wonderful. He was really inspiring to work with, and because it was my first film, I didn't know how lucky I was. She would go on to make several more horror films for AIP, most of them co-starring Price, before leaving acting in the late 70s to become a producer. According to Dwyer's uncle, Witchfinder was one of the several horror films the British character actor Rupert Davies performed in during the later stage of his career. He was in the oblong box. Davies was not pleased when he discovered that the filming of his torture scenes was to be augmented with live rats placed on his body. The actor recalled Reeves instructing him, "Don't move. Wait until one of them starts nibbling your jaw. Then you might move your head a little." An often repeated anecdote states that Reeves found Russell's high-pitched voice unsuitable for such a rough character and had all of his dialogue dubbed by Bernard Kay, who also played the fisherman. However, Bill Kelly doubts this story, noting that Russell's voice in Inspector Clouseau is similar to what appears in Witchfinder. Production began on September 18, 1967, with a budget of £83,000. AIP contributed £32,000, with £12,000 for Price's expenditures and fees, and £20,000 for production costs. Philip Wadalove, a former BBC radio and record producer, contributed £5,000 in return for associate producer billing. Although the film would be the biggest budgeted title in Tygon's history, AIP's cost represented a relatively small expenditure. AIP heads Samuel Z. Arkoff and James H. Nicholson did not expect high-quality result. The movie was intended to be a tax write-off. Shooting was done at locations around East Anglia, including the St. John the Evangelist Church in Rushford, Norfolk, and the Stamford Battle area. The interiors were filmed in two specifically converted aircraft hangars near Bury St. Edmunds in Suffolk, which were leased for £1,500. This cost measure resulted in much of the dialogue having to be re-recorded later because the tin roofs of the hangars caused an echo. The exterior shots range from the Dunwich coast for the scene with the fishermen to Langley Park outside London for the scene where the steam escapes capture. The tracking shot of the ambush after the opening credits was filmed at Black Park in South Buckinghamshire, a location frequently used by Hammer Film Productions. Lavingham Square in Lavingham, Suffolk, site of the witch burning scene, was the real Lavingham Market Square. The crew lowered TV antennas and telephone wires, and Waddy Love hired a cherry picker from a local utility company for £10 because the unit could not afford a camera crane. Countryside vistas seen in the chase scenes on horseback were shot on the Stamford Battle area near Thetford, Norfolk. The producer, through connections with the government, was able to lease part of the area. The church used in the film is St. John the Evangelist in Rushford, Norfolk. The moat drowning and hanging scenes were filmed at Kentwell Hall in Long Melford. The climax of the film was shot at Oxford Castle on the coast of East Anglia. Filming wrapped as scheduled on November 13th, 1967. The production went relatively smoothly, except for unrelentingly antagonistic relationship that developed between Reeves and Price. Reeves told everyone associated with the production that the U.S. actor was not his choice for the role, and the director's comments had reached the actor back in the U.S. Reeves refused the courtesy of meeting Price at Heathrow Airport when he arrived in England, a deliberate snub calculated to offend both Price and AIP. Take your gall dang young genius, Price reportedly said to co-producer Philip Wadalove, who greeted the actor at the airport instead of Reeves. When Price went on location and met Reeves for the first time, the young director told the actor, "I didn't want you, and I still don't want you, but I'm stuck with you." According to Kim Newman in his book Nightmare Movies, when Reeves made a suggestion on the set, Price objected and told the director, "I've made 87 sick films. What have you done?" And Reeves responded, "I made 3 good ones." Price later recalled that this was one of the first movies where he clashed with the director. Price felt that all the actors on the set had a difficult time with the director, who Price believed did not understand how to give instructions to actors. In one scene, Reeves needed Price to shoot his flintock between the ears of the horse he was riding. When Price realized that Reeves had ordered an actual blank charge was to be used so the weapon's puff of smoke would be visible, he shouted, "What? You want the gun to go between the ears of your effing nag? How do you think he's going to react?" However, Reeves insisted, and when the gun went off, the horse reared and sent Price tumbling onto the ground. Price was not hurt, but he was extremely angered by the incident. On the following shooting, Price showed up on the set visibly intoxicated. Reeves seethed to Waddy "He's drunk. How dare he be drunk on the set? I'll kill the bastard." Waddy soon discovered that Reeves planned to inflict painful revenge on the actor. During preparations for Price's violent death scene, the actor was overheard instructing Ogilvy to really lay into Vincent with the stage acts. When the scene was filmed, Ogilvy responded with blows that were faked, but Waddy had fitted Price's costume with padding, protecting the actor from injury. Despite the tension between the two men during production, when Price saw the film the following year, he admitted that he understood Reeves' artistic vision and wrote the young director a 10-page letter praising the film. Reeves wrote Price back, "I knew you would think so." Years after Reeves' death, Price said, "I realized what he wanted was a low-key, very laid-back, menacing performance. He did get it, but I was fighting him almost every step of the way. Had I known what he wanted, I would have cooperated." Reeves also had to deal with other problems during the shooting. On the first day, Price was thrown from his horse and sent back to his hotel to recover. The actor returned to work the following day. Towards the end of filming, a strike was called when the British Technicians Union learned that the production company was not hiring a large enough crew as required by union rules. After an extra man was hired, the crew resumed working. On 2 occasions, Reeves was short of actors. Waddy replaced an absent actor as a roundhead officer during Weimark's one-day scene. Waddy's wife, Susie, played one of the women in the animal enclosure during the witch burning sequence. The film's violent ending deviated from the script due to a continuity problem. In the scene as written, Trooper Swallow was supposed to use both his and Harcourt's flintstock pistols to shoot both Hopkins and Richard dead. However, only Harcourt was depicted in previous scenes as carrying a pistol, and therefore only one person could be shot. When this plot hole was discovered, Reeves immediately told the actor Nicky Henson, "All right, just shoot Vincent, and I'll get Land to scream and shout and go mad and freeze frame on Hilary Dwyer screaming." Several additional nude scenes were filmed during production, set in a pub and involving local wenches. The sequences were reportedly solely intended for the film's German release version. Reeves refused to take part in the filming of these sequences, and they were completed by the crew after the initial versions of the scenes had been shot, with Tygon Tensor acting as director. According to Waddy, Louis M. Hayward, AIP's head of European productions, appeared at the location only to ensure those additional scenes were filmed. The credits read, "Additional scenes by Louis M. Hayward." According to Ogilvy, this was an in-joke because for Reeves, additional scenes meant some prick of a producer putting his oar in and messing up what the director had done. Witchfinder General Score was composed by Reeves' friend Paul Ferris, who had previously scored The Sorcerers and acted in the film under the alias Maurice Jarre, a reference to his favorite composer, Maurice Jarre. He drew inspiration from the folk song Greensleeves in writing the romantic-themed Peaceful Interlude as a means of evoking its time period, as well as to serve as a counterpoint to the film's violence. Film critic Tim Lucas compared the score to Marcello Giambi's music for the swashbuckler film Knives of the Avenger, saying that each film is a historical melodrama that functions as a metaphorical Western. Ferris's ambitious clash with Tensor. The composer hoped to have the score performed with traditional Elizabethan instruments, a creative choice that Tensor vetoed for budgetary reasons. He instead conducted a 55-piece orchestra with whom he recorded at Olympic Studios in February 1968. He paid most of the performers' wages with his own money when Tensor refused to sanction additional funds, although he was later reimbursed after Tensor was impressed with his efforts. Ferris sold the publishing and master rights for the soundtrack to De Wolf Music, who incorporated it into their large library of stock music and released the score alongside Peter Knight's music for the Tygon AIP film Curse of the Crimson Altar on their album Strange Location, credited to the London Studio Orchestra. De Wolf eventually released an original soundtrack album in 2013. The CD release includes a 12-page booklet containing stills from the film and liner notes by Tensor biographer John Hamilton. In a piece written for the British Film Institute commemorating the 50th anniversary of Witchfinder General's original release, Adam Scoville identified weaponized belief represented by Hopkins' exploitations of the irrationalities and superstitions of the populace as a means of gaining power and fulfilling his sexual and political ambitions as the film's primary thematic concern, stating that belief doesn't create his sword, but it most definitely sharpens it. He also describes the use of pastoral violence, whereby the beauty of the English countryside is juxtaposed with acts of extreme violence, notably in the opening scene depicting the hanging of a condemned witch. Writing for Sydney Outsider, Jerry Wythe believes the film brilliantly recreates that sense of social collapse, and its commentary has merit in critiquing the policies of historical witch hunts, which have resonated with contemporary audiences in light of McCarthyism and the Vietnam War, expanding on Ian Sinclair's assertion that the film's success lies in the tension between Tom Baker's utopian permissiveness, his feel for the country, and Reeves' demonic fatalism. White describes Witchfinder as an English Western. Noting Reeves' long-standing interest in the genre, he identifies the film's various connections to it, including its frequent horse riding sequences, clear distractions between good and evil, and Marshall's pursuit of revenge against Hopkins. Responding to David Pine's acclamation of the film as one of the most personal and mature statements in the history of British cinema, White also considers the film to be one of the few fictionalized portrayals of the English Civil War to feature a serious, positive depiction of the new model army and the good old cause, compared to such films as Cromwell and To Kill a King. Which he described as detached travesties of truth, mere hagiographies of Cromwell that lack the vision, intensity, and invention of Reeves' low-budget improvised gem. Witchfinder General is commonly cited as an example of the subgenre of folk horror and is often grouped with the Blood on Satan's Claw and The Wicker Man. The Blood on Satan's Claw is 1971. The Wicker Man is 1973. As definitive works of the genre, this association was popularized by Matt Gatisse in the 2010 documentary series A History of Horror, and is expanded on in later works such as Adam Scoville's 2017 book Folk Horror, Hours Dreadful and Things Strange, and Kiera La Janice 2021 documentary Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, A History of Folk Horror. Scoville connects these films to folk horror because in all three, characters are physically and or socially isolated in a rural landscape where they confront hostile belief systems. Biographer Benjamin Halligan suggests that the film is a pinnacle in Reeves' evolution as a filmmaker, with the she-beast representing a straightforward approach to the trappings of the horror genre, the sorcerers acting as an allegorical commentary on cinema itself, and Witchfinder serving as a work that transcends genre fiction by using its conventions to create something different altogether. From its time, Witchfinder generally was considered an unusually sadistic film. British film censor John Trevelyan was reportedly a distant cousin of Michael Reeves, and he accepted the good director's good intentions when Reeves explained why he felt it was necessary to include such intense violence in the movie. Trevelyan nonetheless argued the film gave the impression that it was exploiting violence and, in particular, sadism for commercial reasons. Reeves agreed to make some of the initial minor cuts himself, but when additional and more extensive demands were made, he adamantly refused to take part in any further editing. Trevelyan claimed that Reeves later wrote him a letter admitting that the cuts were not as harmful as he expected. No copy of the letter has ever surfaced, and based on several other comics the director subsequently made about how the edits ruined his film, Reeves' biographer Benjamin Halligan believes Trevelyan may have somehow misremembered the existence of this letter, confusing it with an earlier missive from the director in which he made a plea for BBFC's leniency. The truncated version received considerable controversy from UK film critics for the amount of violence shown on the screen. In the Sunday Times, Dilys Powell emphasized the hanging, burning, raping, and screaming, and called the film peculiarly nauseating. Both The Guardian and Margaret Hinksman of the Sunday Telegraph felt the film was filled with extravagant sadism. The Monthly Film Bulletin said, "Not since Peeping Tom has a film aroused such an outcry about nastiness and gratuitous violence as this one." Peeping Tom is another great film. The pacing of the film was criticized by playwright Alan Bennett, who stated there were no funny moments to offset the horror. Although initially infuriated with Bennett's critique, Reeves later indicated that Bennett's reaction confirmed his decision to incorporate extreme violence in the film. Several critics praised the film and its horror elements. John Russell Taylor in the Times Saturday Review praised Reeves, stating, "He already has real achievements behind him, not merely good horror films, but good films, period." Films and Filming praised Price's performance as Hopkins and stated that the film was horrifying. AIP heads Arkoff and Nicholson originally contributed their portion of the budget as a tax write-off, but when they were screened the completed film, they were astonished by its quality. Arkoff noted that Michael Reeves brought out some element in Vincent that hadn't been seen in a long time. In the US, the film was not subject to any censorship, and it was released to AIP's usual mix of drive-ins and grindhouses on a double bill with The Young, the Evil, and the Savage, in an attempt to link the film with Roger Corman's earlier Edgar Allan Poe series of films. It was retitled The Conqueror Worm. Brief prologue and epilogue narrations by Price, taken from Poe's poem, were added to justify the new title. The film went nearly unnoticed by critics during its U.S. release. Some reviewers criticized the film's script and high level of violence. While Variety praised Dwyer's performance, they felt it was hampered by Michael Reeves' mediocre script and ordinary direction. Renato Adler also praised the acting in the New York Times, despite the lacking of critical support. The film was a modest success in the United States, earning $1.5 million for AIP, according to Cinema Fantastique magazine. That's not a bad return on investment. In his biography of Reeves, Benjamin Halligan claims the film made $10 million in the US. After its initial release in the spring of 1968, several critics began championing the film in the UK and US. Critics praised the film as Reeves' best work and highlighted the film's pacing. Critics positively highlighted the English countryside as the setting and the performances by the actors. In 2000, Derek Malcolm included Witchfinder General as part of his series of the century of films, a list of what he considered to be the 100 most artistically and culturally important films of the 20th century. I would say this is in the top 20 for sure. Forget top 100. I'm saying top 20. In 2005, the magazine Total Film named Witchfinder General the 15th greatest horror film of all time. The film has obtained cult status, with Jay Hoberman of The Village Voice attributed to the death of its director before the film's release, the acting performance of the cast, and the depiction of evil acts by political figures resonating with the audiences. A contrary assessment came from Alex Cox, who in his introduction to the film in 1992 episode of BBC Two's Movie Drome praised Price's performance as being untroubled by his American accent, but otherwise described the film as a fairly routine Price horror film. He also stated that the film's violence was tame compared to the Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street films. While some reviewers have praised the film for its historical accuracy, others have questioned its adherence to a historical fact. Malcolm Gaskill, fellow and former Doctor of Studies in History at Churchill College in Cambridge, critiqued the film as a travesty of historical truth, and he stated that the only historical accurate facts in the film were that Hopkins and his assistant tortured, tried, and hanged John Lowes, the vicar of Brandeston. Based on its historical accuracy, Gaskill rated the film 3 out of 10. Witchfinder General inspired American International Pictures, AIP, to promote more movies linked to Edgar Allan Poe, including The Oblong Box, which also has Mr. Rupert Davies. Another great flick, The Oblong Box. Highly recommended. Linked to Poe's story, The Premature Burial, and Cry the Banshee, very loosely linked to Poe's poem, The Bells. The Oblong Box starred Price and was originally scheduled to be directed by Reeves, but was given to Gordon Hessler after Reeves quit a week prior to the production. Hessler also directed Cry the Banshee, which featured Price and Dwyer. It was derivative of Witchfinder General, but it portrayed the witches as real and contained more explicit sexual violence. Tygun followed up on Witchfinder General by modifying the story for its 1971 release, Blood on Satan's Claw. The setting was moved from the Victorian era to the 18th century, and other elements were added to make it more similar to Witchfinder. Witchfinder General was popular in Germany, and it inspired new films in the same genre. Similar films, fully or partially financed by German production companies, included Mark of the Devil, The Bloody Judge, which is another great flick, Jess Franco, Christopher Lee, and Hexen Gerschanen und zu Tode, released in the US as Mark of the Devil Part 2. Some critics maintain that Ken Russell's The Devils was influenced by Reeves' film. However, Russell said that he hated Reeves' film, describing it as one of the worst movies I have ever seen, and certainly the most nauseous. Witchfinder General was the inspiration for a BBC Radio 4 play, Vincent Price and the Horror of the English Blood Beast, first broadcast in March 2010. In 2016, director Nicholas Winding Refn and distributor Rupert Preston obtained the remake rights to Witchfinder General. In 2019, John Hillcoat was announced as a director for the remake. English doom metal band Witchfinder General took their name from the film. The export version, which contained both the previously cut violence and alternative shots of topless nudity film for overseas release, was passed uncut by the BBFC in 1995 and released on the VHS by Redemption in 2001. And DVD was released in UK by Metrodome, consisting of two versions: the complete director's cut containing the 2 minutes of previously censored violence, and the aforementioned export version with the violence intact and shots of nudity added to certain sequences. In both versions, the 2 minutes of violence have been taken from what has been described as a grainy VHS source. Some critics complained that watching the film in this manner was jarring or distracting. The soundtrack of the newly inserted new shots had brief snippets of audio repeating itself because of the timing involved in inserting the previously cut footage. In the US, while censorship of the film has never been a factor, the film experienced numerous delays in appearing on home video in its originally intended form. When Orion Pictures acquired the rights to many AIP's titles in the 1980s, they were unwilling to also purchase rights to the music soundtracks of some of the films, including Witchfinder General, and they replaced the original music with synthesizer scores by composer Kendall Schmidt. Tim Lucas described Schmidt's rescoring as a betrayal to every effort the original film made to remain true to its time frame. For years, Ferris's original score was not available in the US on home video releases, although it was included on theatrical and syndicated television prints. The HBO videotape release from the late 1980s used the Orion version, which also included the nude inserts. Lucas says the spoken soundtrack is not correctly matched to these newly added shots. A restored version was released on DVD under the Midnight Movies banner on September 11, 2007 by 20th Century Fox Home Entertainment. The release includes the complete uncut version of the film with the Ferris score intact, Price's opening and closing narration tacked on the AIP Conqueror Worm version, as well as the alternate nude sequences were not available on this release, but were included in the UK Blu-ray release from Odeon Entertainment, issued in June 2011. The Blu-ray utilized the same high-definition transfer as the 2007 MGM DVD and was completely uncut. Screen Factory included the film as part of the company's multi-title Vincent Price Blu-ray box set released in fall of 2013. And now that I'm up over 48 minutes, I'll go into the section of this film where it gets a whopping 6.7 out of 10 on IMDb, 13,000 ratings. The Conquer Worm poster, or a DVD cover, I should say, is awesome. It says, "Leave the children home, and if you are squeamish, stay home with them." Witchfinder General, original title Matthew Hopkins Witchfinder General, 1968, unrated, 1 hour 26 minutes, perfect timing, although the uncut version might be worth a watch depending on how grainy the VHS transfer was. During the English Civil War, a young Roundhead seeks vengeance against a vicious witch hunter and his henchmen who have terrorized the soldier's fiancée and wrongfully executed her uncle. Yeah. So Anthony Hopkins gives people due process by drowning them in the river to see if they swim or float. More like this, The Blood on Satan's Claw, The Mask of the Red Death, The Pit and the Pendulum, and Theater of Blood, another movie that I'll be reviewing very soon. I want to see The Blood on Satan's Claw. Vincent Price regarded his performance here as the finest of his horror movie career. There are several references to the value of payments in guineas. However, the gold coin of that name was not minted until 1663, 18 years after the film was set. Matthew Hopkins is quoted as saying, "Men sometimes have strange motives for the things they do." All British versions prior to 1996 were cut by 1 minute 26 seconds by the UK censor on original release. The Redemption video release restores this material from a US Laserdisc. All right. Here's a review from Xtal, dated October 28, 2022, relatively recent review, giving it a 7 out of 10. And the title of the review on IMDb is "A High Price to Pay for Deviation." They decided you're not welcome around here, so they've called for the Witchfinder to appear to confirm that you're a witch. They will probe and make you twitch before you're drowned, then tightly bound to burn in fear. It's a great way for a psychopath to live, by taking lives he feels he has so much to give. If you challenge him, you've tried, but he'll never be denied, as he connives, concocts, contrives, but won't forgive. The barbaric days of 17th century England, as the brutality of the church is brought to bear on those deviating from expected norms, brilliantly executed by Vincent Price. I'm not sure what they mean by church. I guess they mean Protestant? I don't know. They can't be talking about the Catholic Church, right? Anyways. England is torn in civil strife as the Royalists battle the parliamentary party for control. This conflict distracts people from rational thought and allows unscrupulous men to gain local power by exploiting village superstitions. One of these men is Matthew Hopkins, who tours the land offering his services as a persecutor of witches. Aided by his sadistic accomplice John Steam, he travels from city to city and wrenches confessions from witches in order to line his pockets and to gain sexual favors. When Hopkins persecutes a priest, he incurs the wrath of Richard Marshall, who is engaged to the priest's niece. Risking treason by leaving his military duties, Marshall relentlessly pursues the evil Hopkins and his minion Stern. This is a storyline by Ed Sutton, whose email is esutton@mindspring.com. So there you have it. My review of Witchfinder General in less than an hour. Going down my list, the next three movies are Balance of Power, 1996, Terminal Velocity, 1994, and The Abominable Dr. Phibes, 1971. I'll see you tomorrow, Christmas Day. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. Laters.